afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to be here in this beautiful town of Strasbourg and like to thank the organizers for the kind invitation. So I was encouraged to talk about modeling the evolution of social complexity and order. And I was trying to look back into how I imagine cooperation and social order might have evolved over time. I'm not an anthropologist though, so if I don't get it right in terms of the order, don't be too harsh at me. But from the very beginning, humans were facing cooperation dilemmas, such as the stag hunt game. So if you hunt, you can decide yourself to hunt by yourself and maybe catch a rabbit. But if you cooperate with others, then you might be able to actually hunt a stag. And so this is one of the games that you'll face later on when I get more formal and come up with models. Another of these cooperation problems is known as public goods problem. And basically, there are things that need to be done, for example, cleaning the cave. Yeah? And the question is, who is going to do it? Everyone will benefit from cleaning, but most likely there will be some people who do it and others who free ride. So in the public goods game, basically, we are supposed to make contributions to the public good, but if some people don't, everyone gets the benefit, and that creates a situation that destabilizes cooperation and might create a non-cooperative outcome. Now, people have come up very early with ideas how to stabilize cooperation, because that is apparently very important for our society and for social order. And one of these mechanisms is called peer punishment. So we punish each other if we don't comply with social norms. Social norms is also considered to be an invention, and punishment is basically the mechanism to stabilize them. Here are some experiments that have been done as late as 2002 by Fair and Gechter, which show that in such kind of public goods games, punishment allows cooperation to thrive, while without a punishment, opportunity or institution, cooperation will decline. But it's not just that we punish each other. Actually, it's important that we are friendly to each other, and I will come up later with a theory that explains why we are friendly. But just suppose the very beginning, the first humans. So the issue is, would you survive the next night? Could you trust basically your neighbors, or would they kill you? And in the beginning there was a lot of killing, in fact. And that was not good for high population density. So in order for people to live together, they had to get sufficiently peaceful, sufficiently non-aggressive. And in fact, there is evidence for this. We know that also from bacteria and viruses, and sometimes they're very aggressive in the beginning, but then basically they become more friendly to the host, because they need the host, they need us to spread them. So if they kill us too violently, then it basically reduces their spreading. So there is a mechanism that reduces aggression over time, and this is very important, because then people could live together. But in the beginning, people were not living in a fixed place. They were hunting, and whenever the animals were hunted, they had to move to another place. So it was very important that people learned to grow plants and also to farm animals. And as they became more efficient, basically, creating the food that they required, they could stay in the same place, and it was very important actually for them to be able to accumulate things. So once they have been able to do that, they could live in a certain place. They could establish communities in something like cities. And one of the important steps is, of course, the creation of these family clans. We know that from the Bible and from many areas of the world. people have been living in these clans for a very long time. And that basically established a mechanism of kin selection or genetic favoritism. We know, however, that this mechanism also has side effects. So, for example, we know that there is blood revenge and there are ethical conflicts and ethnic conflicts. And this basically is the side effect of this genetic favoritism. So basically people had to come up with better mechanisms to establish cooperation. And before I go into these, I'd like to point out that, of course, once you live in communities, you start to imitate others' behaviors. That's very important because you can learn more quickly. And imitation, on the other hand, is also the reason why we can actually apply the replicator equation from the theory of evolution to social-cultural evolution. So I'm giving you here a very short derivation of this. So there is an equation that describes the relative frequency of strategies or behaviors in a population. Here we also allow for different kinds of population by the index A or B. And there are transitions from one kind of strategy to another one. These are the transition rates. And here is a specification of these transition rates. So they're basically spontaneous transitions, there are imitation processes, and there are avoidance processes, and that's more or less it if you consider up to binary interaction. And this is a Boltzmann-like equation. Now, this equation can describe surprisingly many social and economic phenomena, actually. And one of the special cases is the replicator equation. We get it if we neglect avoidance processes and spontaneous changes, but we just assume imitation processes. And while assuming imitation processes, we assume that we only imitate strategies or behaviors that create an expected higher success. And if we plug this into the equation that I showed on the previous slide, then we end up with the very same replicator equation that we know from evolutionary theory. So the mechanisms are different. It's not genetic inheritance, but it's imitation, but the resulting equations are the same. And that has very fundamental implications because it means that evolution can happen in two ways. In a genetic way, which is based basically on the material side, biological matter, but it can also be based on the spreading of ideas, which is non-material, it doesn't have so much inertia, and this kind of evolution is much quicker. So that has really boosted the evolution. It has created a much higher speed. So this is one of the greatest inventions of the world, in a sense, and it happened. It just happened. It's really amazing. Now, once you have settlements, coming back to what I've been explaining before, you can have more and more specialization and differentiation. Yeah? So everyone can start to do what he or she is best at, and that creates really, again, amazing possibilities. Now, what is also important is that when you live in a settlement, you encounter the same people again and again and again. So you have repeated interactions, and we know that this creates something like a shadow of the future, and that's a mechanism that's making people also more cooperative. So it creates direct reciprocity, such as friendship. However, this mechanism as well has some potential side effects, which is corruption. Yeah. So, but certainly, it's not based anymore on killing other people. So, we could consider that a much better mechanism. And this large diversity then creates all sorts of goods like pottery and tools of all kinds, and clothes, and so on. And people start trading between different settlements. And that establishes cooperation between strangers. In fact, there is a very nice study by Rolf Ziegler about the Kula ring, and it looks at how there was kind of a barter exchange economy created hundreds of years ago already. But then the next invention was made. Indirect reciprocity was invented to help strangers, to help people that we don't know, to be friendly to others. The Good Samaritan is basically the example that symbolizes this idea. But in a sense, trading with money also promotes indirect reciprocity. It goes away from a barter economy where I give you this and you give me something else that I need to be interested in exchange. So now suddenly I give you something, I get money, and if you don't have anything that I'm interested in, I give the money to somebody else who has something that I'm interested in. So that's much more flexible. Yeah? Great invention again. So indirect reciprocity. So the mechanism become more and more sophisticated in a sense, right? But again, there is a side effect. So gossip, in a sense, nobody likes it really, but it's part of the reputation systems that are behind indirect reciprocity. And yeah, cities grow through all these successful inventions that promote cooperation, and cooperation between strangers emerges. But then also institutions are being invented, such as courts, for example. Roman law is a very famous example. It's the basis of the law in many countries today. So that was really a major invention. Now there is a lot of discussion about war. How important is war for the spreading of culture? And some people say, okay, we wouldn't be where we are without all these many wars. I am not so sure about that, to be honest. It sounds a little bit like an excuse for war and giving it positive connotations. And we're living in days where we need to worry again about wars. What I recognize, though, that it was very important to have an exchange of people. It means migration. And we had that not just, in the past years. Many countries are complaining about migration, but that is ages old. It was part of the history of humanity, and it was very important for us to make progress because it was bringing ideas from here to there. So it allowed to accumulate ideas. And we need to recognize that it's also important today. And we need to learn how to deal with migration, with migrants. We should appreciate their knowledge. Another very important invention was then to spread this knowledge that was accumulated through schools and through teaching. And last but not least, science, of course, was very important to accumulate the knowledge that allowed us to be successful, to create social order, to create culture, and all this. And we should make sure that we're not endangering what we have created over hundreds and thousands of years by wars and serious conflicts and other stupid things. Now, talking about science, let's get a bit more formal about the evolution of coordination, cooperation, and fairness preferences and friendliness. And so I'm talking now a little bit about evolutionary game theory, and in fact, I've shown you already this replicator equation, which is at the heart of evolutionary game theory. So one of the questions that I was interested in already during my diploma thesis was the avoidance behavior of pedestrians. I noticed that pedestrian flows were organized in lanes of uniform walking directions, and moreover I noticed that there was a preferred side. So in many European countries people tend to walk on the right hand side. So I wanted to understand that. Why is it that way? So basically we have two pedestrians and they have to walk around each other. If both of them go to the right hand side, then they will be able to pass each other. So they have been successful. The interaction has a beneficial outcome b greater than 0. If one goes to the right and the other one goes to the left, however, they won't succeed. 0 payoff, no success, right? And the same thing, of course, when both go to the left, then there's a benefit and so on. So basically we have two players, you could say, in the language of game theory, two strategies or possible behaviors, and that is the game, the game's payoff matrix that quantifies the success of the combination of the behaviors and strategies of these people. Then the question is, how would basically the proportion of people who go to the right and who go to the left change over time? And in fact, it's possible to plug in this payoff matrix in the equations I showed you before, and then we get certain expected successes, we get successes for the individual strategies, and finally we can simplify the resulting equation and it gives this. So that's the replicator equation for this coordination game, as this game is called. And you can see that this has three stationary solutions that you get by putting this to 0. One solution is a 50-50 situation, p equals to 1/2. That's the situation that we would think the volt has started with. 50% of people went to the right, 50% went to the left. However, it turns out if we make a stability analysis of these solutions, that this is an unstable solution. If there's just the slightest deviation from the 50-50 situation, the system will be driven towards one of the other stable stationary solution. It would be either everyone goes to the right or everyone goes to the left. In fact, in Japan, people tend to walk on the left. So we can understand the evolution of a behavioral convention by self-initiation. Game theory allows us to explain that. Now basically we got hungry of this fascinating replicator equation, and we might think, okay, can we do other interesting things with it by plugging in other payoff matrices? And in fact we can do that, and here is a more general payoff matrix. Again, for two people, two options, cooperation and non-cooperative behaviors are called defection. And then for a certain kind of situation, this game is called the prisoner's dilemma. That is a situation where cooperation is actually good for everyone. It's much better if both people don't cooperate. However, it turns out if you cooperate and I don't, then I get an even higher payoff, so-called temptation. And you get a very poor payoff, worse than this, called sucker's payoff. So you have been behaving cooperatively and you're punished by a very bad payoff, while I haven't been nice and I get a very high payoff. So cooperation is risky and defection is tempting. And that destabilizes cooperation, even though that's desirable, and as a result we get a tragedy of the commons where everybody's effects, and that is a bad situation for everyone. But besides the prisoner's dilemma, there are other kinds of games, like the harmony game. There, cooperation is not risky, and defection is not tempting, and as a result, cooperation is stable, defection is unstable. and people would always end up cooperating. So yeah, that would be a nice world, right? Heaven on earth. Yeah? Here's the second game. So both cooperation and defection are stable, and the outcome depends on the initial condition. So if enough people initially cooperate, then there will be more and more people cooperating. If there were too little people in the beginning, then you might end up with defection. And snowdrift game or chicken game, again another situation where cooperation and defection are unstable, but there's a certain fraction of cooperators that will finally stabilize. So, yeah, given that formal treatment, let's come back to the social mechanism that I have mentioned before, and there's a very nice treatment by Martin Novak who was mentioned before. So genetic relatedness, repeated interaction, reputation, clustering, and competition between groups. So here the mechanism, as you can see. And it turns out that these mechanisms all transform the payoffs in a way that changes the game. So these are game-changing biological and social mechanisms. And rather than having a prisoner's dilemma, you would end up with a harmony game in case of kin selection. You would end up with a second game in case of direct reciprocity or indirect reciprocity or costly peer punishment. And network interaction could lead you to a snowdrift game. So this is fascinating. You know, we're living in a world that's not just given. We can kind of reinterpret it and change it through social mechanisms, and this way change the payoff structure. So this is what we can understand with the replication equation. But there are certain kind of phenomena that go beyond. If you have interactions in space, for example, then it turns out that neighborhood interactions can allow cooperation to survive in situations where otherwise you would expect only defection. So spatial interactions, neighborhood interactions are beneficial for cooperation, one can say. And I got interested eventually into the question, what role does motion or mobility or migration have? Of course, I was a traffic scientist for some time. That was a natural question. So what will happen when integrating game theoretical models and models of mobility? Will the result be new kinds of self-organization? Can we understand group, class, and niche formation, agglomeration, segregation? What is the role of mobility for social cooperation? I mean, in the first place, you wouldn't think it has nothing to do with cooperation. It's just an independent kind of activity. Yeah? It doesn't matter. That's what you would think. However, we don't look at imitation of well-performing neighbors for a moment, but just look at the possibility to move to neighboring sites where you have more favorable interaction partners and expect higher payoffs, and you would start to move around in space. So we've done computer simulations starting with a situation where we had two populations, the red and the blue one, and they were homogeneously distributed in space. So the same number of people everywhere in every single cell. However, it turns out that if you have the right kind of payoff matrices, then the homogeneous distribution is unstable. And over time, you find pattern formation. And there are different kinds of pattern formation, which is interesting. There can be segregation, as we have seen it in the lane formation of pedestrians. There can be agglomeration, but two kinds. A repulsive one, which we could call ghetto formation, or an attractive one, which we could call clustering. And in fact, we can still do analytical calculations, and here is basically the outcome of these calculations called the phase diagram, and as we change the payoffs, you can see we can get from a situation where we have no better information to a situation where we do have better information, and that happens actually for most of the payoff matrices, and actually the simulation results fit pretty well to this. Now the question is, what happens if we combine this mobility mechanism where you're trying to move to a better place in a certain circle around your current location? If you combine this with imitation of the best performing neighbor strategy, as people have been looking at before. Now, in order for people to move, we need some empty space. This is what you see here in white. Red is defection, blue is cooperation. In the prisoner's dilemma, of course, we expect the level of cooperation to go down over time, and that's what we see. Now, in the migration-only scenario, nobody changes the strategy. That means we will have this 50-50 situation all the time. But what we find is a rearrangement in space. Now, this evolution, by the way, stops in these simulations because we have assumed deterministic rules of migration and imitation. Otherwise, it would go on. Now the question is, what happens if you combine two mechanisms, none of which can improve the fraction of cooperators? Surprisingly, the combination of imitation and migration creates a high level of cooperation. So basically what happens is that cooperators run away from defectors. They can do that because of the migration. And they're seeking other cooperators, and that creates these cooperative islands. And cooperation is profitable. That's why it spreads. So what we find here is something that we know very well from sociology. Basically, the milieu reinforces your behavior. In this case, it can reinforce cooperation. Now things get even more exciting. Well, people have said, okay, this is interesting, but what happens if you have such a cooperative cluster and you put a defector right in the middle? So this is just a perfect paradise for that defector, because there are all cooperators around that defector can exploit. But people would not like to be exploited, so that they would basically start to become defectors too. And defection would spread and all the cooperation would go away, said the referees. And I said, I don't believe you. And of course we had to show it. So let's see what happens. So here we are starting with a situation where we have predominantly cooperation, and people imitate the best performing neighbors, but sometimes we flip randomly the strategies that would result. Okay, so we have some noise that disturbs the system. And as you know, before we had a situation where we still had a finite level of cooperation because of the deterministic imitation mechanism. Here we don't have a deterministic imitation, and what you get is, unfortunately, what you expect from the replicator equation. Cooperation goes away. A very bad outcome. So this little noise is very destructive for cooperation. Same thing for random migration. So now we neglect the imitation for a moment and just have success-driven migration in the neighborhood and random long-term migration. And what you see is the cluster breaks apart because of migration. Very unfortunately end up again with defection. But for the prisoner's dilemma, you wouldn't expect anything else. But anyway, both of these noises are terrible for the society. Now the question is, what happens if you combine it all? Success-driven migration, imitation of the best performing neighbor, and these two terrible noises that destroy cooperation. And I said, okay, let's make it more interesting and start with defection only, with a terrible world, hell on earth. And I told my PhD student, simulate that. I want to know what comes out there. So 2 weeks later, I came back and asked him, did you do the simulation? He said, no. Why not? Because it doesn't make any sense. You won't find anything interesting. It will stay defective. So why should I even start my computer? And so 2 weeks later, I came back and asked him, have you done it in the meantime? And he said, no, because it doesn't make any sense. These are young, self-confident PhD students. And then I had to sit next to my PhD student and say, okay, do it now, the old-fashioned way, unfortunately. And he was right for 5 minutes, okay? And let's see what happened. What happened is, no. Where is this movie? This is not nice. Okay. So defection, terrible world. And then migration breaks it up. Sometimes, because of the noise, we have someone flashing up blue for a very short time. Then, however, after a very long time, 25,000 iterations, then suddenly you have, by coincidence, a small cooperative cluster. But if that is big enough, cooperation starts to pay off. And once it pays off, people start to say, hey, what's happening there now? Oh, they're making a lot of money. They're so successful. I have to do that as well. So everyone starts to become cooperative. We call that the outbreak of cooperation in a nasty, noisy world. And in fact, this is not just happening if you have the right kind of random numbers accidentally. It's always happening, You just have to be patient enough and it will happen. So it's a matter of time. Okay, and that got published in TNS, as you saw. But then their colleagues, they're so smart, they always find something to criticize. And Ernst Wehr is one of them. And he said, didn't your people, when they moved to another place, more or less know before whether that would be a friendly neighborhood or not? And I said, yeah, but by the time they moved there, it might be unfriendly. I said, I think this is a green beard effect. So you basically can see who is a cooperator and who is not, and that explains why migration can produce cooperation. And so I said, it's interesting, but I don't believe it, actually. Well, we had to show it. And so what we did is we came up with another model with migration, where we said, okay, we don't see anymore what other people are playing, what strategy are they using. Everyone just has a memory of the experiences he or she has made over time. That I've earned more before or less before. And so I have a maximum and a minimum payoff that I remember, but I'm forgetting over time a little bit. I have a certain level of expectation where between the minimum and maximum I want to be at least. And if I'm above this line, I would say, okay, I'm happy. And call that satisfying in a sense. And then you would do the same thing and stay in the same place. Win, stay, lose, shift in a sense. If you're below this line, you say, I'm not happy anymore. I go somewhere else. Like some PhD students do sometimes. And you'll see, no, that's not the worst thing to do. So, yes, when basically happiness drops below the expectation, suddenly people either move to another place or change their strategy or do both. And in fact, it turns out that, again, cooperative clusters are formed. It's not as impressive, but it's able to create high levels of cooperation, the blue curve over here. It's pretty high. And then people would still say, okay, that's interesting, and it got published in PNAS, but what about real people? And we said, okay, we go to the lab and we make an experiment of this game that I've just described to you. And of course, we don't know whether people are behaving according to this satisficing rule or not. They would behave according to whatever rule. Maybe they don't even know themselves. And these are the results that we found. So we were comparing a scenario with migration with another scenario where they couldn't actively choose their place. Yeah? And you can see that the migration scenario allowed cooperation to survive, while without active migration, the level of cooperation was going down as expected. What was unexpected is that, with migration it could stay high. And this was work together with Charles Efferson and Karl Rocker and so on. Two of them are from Ernst Fehr's team. When we started to do this together, they thought, we'll never find anything interesting. We'll never work. And now suddenly everyone was surprised that it did work. Yeah? There is a big difference. So migration allows cooperators to avoid exploitation. Migration allows cooperators to form cooperative neighborhoods. Mobile cooperators seek smaller groups. In this case, we made it this way. And mobility is key to success. So payoffs are higher if you're more mobile. You can find it also in the real world. So, yeah, I think that's interesting and pretty unexpected. Okay, then there are other things that people have been thinking about. I told you about peer punishment. So why would people punish others for behaving in a way that we don't like if it requires a conflict, it requires energy, sometimes even an investment if you go to court or whatever, So you would think twice about it and could say, okay, let other people punish these people. Then I don't have the cost, but I have the benefit, and that's why it's called second-order free riding. And for a long time, people haven't really come up with very convincing theories why people would punish when it's costly. So let's look into this. So we open up a strategy space. Well, we assume that we have cooperators and defectors, but besides that we would have cooperators that punish defectors, we call them moralists, and we would have defectors who punish defectors even though they defect themselves, so it's kind of hypercritical behavior, but anyway, we call them immoralists for that reason. So not only do they do the wrong thing, they also punish those people who do the same thing. Yeah, so what happens in such a scenario? Now, if you don't have spatial interactions, or if everyone interacts with everyone else, or everyone interacts randomly with interaction partners, so you roll the dice, assume to interact. Then what we find is that cooperators spread at the cost of moralists, because moralists have this additional punishment cost to pay. Yeah? So they're less successful. So moralists will be crowded out, will disappear, but then the cooperators stay with the defectors, and we know what happens there. No, defectors will exploit them, and we will end up in a tragedy of the commons. Everyone will end up defecting. Now the surprise comes when you simulate the same thing with the same parameters in a spatial setting where people interact with their neighbors and copy the best performing neighbor. So we start with these four strategies, 25% each, randomly distributed. And what we find in the initial stage is that people would, the defectors would spread as expected. Yeah? And if you would open the newspapers, they would say, defectors are taking over the world, the world will come to its end. But then something interesting happens, because you see these clusters are formed. Sometimes it's called homophily, that people with similar behavior cluster together. And as a result of that, the moralists don't have to interact directly with the cooperators anymore. They're separated by these defectors. Which is very important because the moralists are doing better than the defectors, but the defectors are doing better than the cooperators. So the defectors are kind of now crowding out the cooperators, and we end up with a hell of a lot of cooperators who punish defectors. Completely different outcome, opposite outcome, just because of the local interactions in a spatial setting. And then Herb Gintis was with me at their workshop, and he said, I don't believe this. And he was sitting down every evening to write a C++ computer program in order to check it, until he found the same result. So I find this pretty amazing. And by the way, the very same game also displays all sorts of other fascinating outcomes, such as symbiosis of moralists and immoralists in certain kind of situations. It all depends, of course, on the parameter combination. But you can have many different outcomes depending on these combinations. And interestingly enough, there are scenarios where some defectors would even speed up the spreading of the moralists. Okay? Okay, now we've talked about so many mechanisms that can promote cooperation. So why do we still have so many tragedies of the commons? Environmental exploitation, it still exists. Environmental pollution, it's there. Overfishing, climate change. Why don't we get rid of this? So in many cases we say, okay, the tragedies of the commons are because of the selfishness of the people. But is this really true? Or other explanations? Now there's one thing that I'd like to highlight a little bit more, even though I said it implicitly. So let's assume a scenario where people have neighborhood interactions in a circle and imitate the best performing strategy as before, and we have learned that neighborhood interactions are good for cooperation. So this is what we find here. And then what we do is we drop additional connections in this circle, so we make it more and more connected, and that reflects, in a sense, a globalization of the goal, you could say. I mean, in an oversimplified way, but anyway. So what you see is, in the beginning, more connection density increases the level of cooperation dramatically, but then eventually, as things get more and more connected, and eventually everyone is interacting with everyone else, you end up, by necessity, with defection. So, networking, the level of networkedness is important, and it might have been the root cause also of the banking crisis. As Andy Helbing from the Bank of England has pointed out, the global banking network has really become denser and denser over time. And maybe that has destabilized our financial system. So it's worth thinking about. But anyway, are humans really selfish payoff maximizers as assumed by the concept of the Homo economicus? And of course, there are experiments by now, and some of them are called ultimatum game and dictator game. Let me start with the dictator game. So in a dictator game, there are two players and an experimenter. The experimenter would give some money to player one and would say, okay, how much do you want to give to player two? And he might say, nothing. But surprisingly, we'll see in many cases, player one will give some of the money to player two. In the ultimatum game, there's an additional step. Player two can say, I'm not satisfied with your offer. And in this case, it will happen that player one and player two get nothing. So there's an incentive to offer a little bit more in a sense. And so let's have a look at what comes out in these games. And to make it more exciting, we have changed the setting a little bit towards a situation where an experimenter was not giving them money for free. Instead, they had to wait for 60 minutes and could say, okay, you wait 50 minutes, I go after 10 minutes. Pretty nasty. And everyone got the same amount of money for participating in the game. Now, we looked at different levels of anonymity, and you would think, okay, if they never meet, and they also never meet the experimenter, maybe then they behave more nasty, and if they happen to be in the same room, they may still think, oh, maybe I should be a bit friendly, you know. So anonymity should make people less fair. But surprisingly, the level of anonymity doesn't have that much impact on the outcome. We have pretty many fair offers, some not so fair, and in particular in the dictator game where there is no punishment step in terms of, you know, I can say I'm not happy with this. And then player one would also not get anything. So surprisingly much fairness, and I said, okay, I don't believe this, you know. They're still in the same building, you know, they think perhaps that when the experiment is over, they might meet in the staircase or whatever, and they might feel uncomfortable, whatever. So we said we need to have even more anonymity. I just didn't believe it, you know. I saw, okay, when there's full anonymity, that people should just be selfish. So we made a web experiment. People would never meet. But of course we couldn't have people wait, because they would start listening to music and wash their dishes and do homework and things like that. So we asked them to do hundreds of arithmetic calculations. And these hundreds of arithmetic calculations could be shared. They could say, okay, you make 400, I make 200, or you make 600, I do nothing. And surprisingly, again, people were damn fair. So, however, it turns out that if you look into more details of these experiments, and they had a number of different treatments, then neither fairness-oriented rational choice theory nor a selfish-oriented rational choice theory would fully explain the outcomes of the experiment. And it's important to recognize that there are different types of individuals. Then give me maybe a few more minutes, because it will still get pretty interesting. So the response of rational choice theory is, okay, people don't maximize payoffs, they maximize utilities. But then the problem is, now, how do you determine individual utilities? You would have to do that empirically for every single person separately. That's not a predictive theory. But we would like to have a predictive theory, so we should have a theory that's able to predict the utility function. And the question is it possible to create such a theory, kind of to complete decision theory? And the answer is yes. And here is a theory that I've developed that explains the evolution of the Homo socialis. So, why are we social, after all? Because in many cases people have argued, if we are friendly to others, we are giving away advantages and payoffs to others, and they will be more successful, have more kids, I will be less successful, have less kids, you know, so the friendly people should die out. Is this true? So we've looked into 4 assumptions, none of which would imply an evolution of fair behavior, but let's look into this in a little bit more detail. So, first assumption, agents decide according to a best response rule that strictly maximizes the utility function, given the behaviors of their interaction partners and neighbors. Okay, that's the economic assumption. We don't assume imitation, because imitation, you know, always tends to promote cooperation. We go the nasty way and say no imitation here, strict best response, and that would really not favor cooperation. Then the utility function considers not only the own payoff, but gives a certain weight to the payoff of the interaction partners. This weight is called friendliness, but it's set to 0 for everyone at the beginning of the simulation. So everyone is nasty in the beginning. Then comes evolution. Friendliness is a trait that is inherited to offspring. The likelihood to have an offspring increases exclusively with the payoff, not the utility. The payoff is assumed to be zero when a friendly agent is exploited by all neighbors. Therefore, such an agent will never have any offspring. And finally, there's mutation, but in order to avoid a trivial result like genetic drift, we specify mutation in a way that the expected value of friendliness would be 0.2. We'll see, however, that we'll find much higher friendliness values for certain parameter ranges. Now, what's the outcome? In fact, we find that for most parameter combinations, the homo economicus results, selfishness, as economists have assumed for a long time. But there is a small corner where a homo socialis results with other regarding friendly preferences. And this is the area where basically children are raised with their parents. And this is what we do. Yeah? We spent 18 years or whatever to raise our children with us. That's special. Among all of the animals, if we consider ourselves an animal as well, this is special. And this is important really for this evolution of fairness preferences. So surprisingly, evolution has made us other regarding, and actually it creates more payoff. It allows us to overcome tragedies of the commons, and we find, however, a broad distribution of these friendliness preferences. So not everyone is the same. But that is very much in consistence with empirical results. While there are some selfish people, most people have pro-social preferences, and that's what our simulation reproduces quite well. And in fact, we could have known earlier, because Adam Smith, in his other book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, already pointed such a thing out. And with this, I'm concluding. Even now, I could talk for hours, you probably believe me, and my further conclusion is that evolution will take us to another stage of our society. The future of humans is, I believe, not technologically enhanced cyborgs that we implant memory chips and special senses and all these kind of things. But I think the evolution will be based on social cultural evolution. And that requires a large level of diversity, because diversity is the driver of innovation and increase of fitness over time. But we are very bad actually at coping with the level of diversity that we have already. So this is where we have to get better. And I think, however, that information technologies will enable us to solve this problem. We'll be able to have information-based help to deal with this diversity, and then we can basically go into the next step of evolution, which will be based on collective intelligence, because the world has become so complex that a single brain or a single supercomputer cannot anymore understand it. To take successful decisions, we'll have to combine our knowledge, our intelligence to create something bigger. So it's basically imagined to be something like we're becoming networked minds. And this networking, we're reaching out beyond our own personality, in a sense, to be successful. And everyone does that. And we will eventually learn this. And it's important to recognize that neither top-down decision-making nor majority decision-making are enabling us to create this collective intelligence that we will need. But again, we'll invent new social mechanisms that will allow us to solve the problems that we're confronted with. So, thank you very much.
Thank you for this talk full of hope. I just have a question about the experiments you made about economical experiments or social behavior altruism in experiments. Don't you think that people want to show that they are altruistic in experiments more than in real life?
Well, in real life we find it as well. And in Switzerland, for example, it's really typical that if you see somebody running towards the tram and you understand, okay, the person wants to catch the tram, that somebody would press the button and stop the tram. If you're in the plane and your luggage is over there, somebody would reach it over to you and would never see that person again. Now, it's just some communities have understood that being friendly to each other is a benefit to everyone. Yeah.
Thank you.
You have described the development of what you call indirect reciprocity involving the use of money. But in fact, recently we have observed a reverse trend, namely that in some communities people are exchanging goods and services directly. What are the advantages, what are the motivation? Does this improve the better and friendlier relations in the neighborhood?
That's an interesting question, and I think that might be one aspect, but the other aspect is that apparently our financial system has not always done a great job. We have seen that in 2008 when we had the financial meltdown, and we're still struggling actually with the result of that. So people have basically lost a certain amount of trust into this institution of money. But on the other hand, the value of money is just a matter of trust. It's psychology in a sense, right? And I think also here we need to have a new institution, and my prediction is that we'll have to come up with multidimensional money. The one-dimensionality is not sufficient for sophisticated self-regulation processes. Multidimensionality will allow it, so I'm very much pushing in this direction. And in a sense, multidimensionally would mean that you would have to engage in different dimensions of our life, and social engagement could be one of these dimensions, and that goes again into the direction that you were hinting.
Thank you very much for a very nice talk. I have one question about the notion of the cooperative learning terms, the definition. What if in this model, have you have a look at the change, the evolution of the definition of the word cooperation within the clusters or individuals?
The change of the meaning of the word.
Well, cooperation on its own, for me and my colleague would be for something, for example, working on the same experiment, that would cooperate together. And that would be a given time. This cooperation could change in any time what it was from the beginning, so something at the end wouldn't be, maybe absolutely be the case. Or if you look at it, for example, with the political parties, you have the notion of the cluster, the definition have defined one thing to work with, but finally it becomes something that is not. For example, after the election, if you have a look at that. So the meaning of the cooperation on its own actually is bound to evolve as we have experience. It's not the same thing from the beginning. So in these models, you taking into account in this one the evolution of the word of cooperation, the meaning of the cooperation.
I mean, in the first place, it's a word that's being used in different ways anyway. There are kind of situations of cooperation where there is not a conflict of interest and cooperation is the natural outcome, like the harmony game. Many times people talk about cooperation in a context where they mean altruism, but I also think the word altruism is used in a very wrong way in many cases. Yeah? So for example, when the friendliness evolves, in the end, being friendly is not being altruistic because you have a higher payoff. There's just a very short time period where kind of the first unconditional cooperators or unconditionally friendly people occur when they're exploited by everyone and cooperation doesn't pay off but hurts. So there's a short altruistic phase and you have to go through it. You have to get over this hill in a sense. But it's kind of not the final stage. But anyway, when you're talking about the change of meaning, I think it's interesting to look at in the context of social norms, because this is what's pretty typical for social norms, that they would change their meaning over time. And basically it's also adjusted to, how would you say, to new ways of thinking. Like, cultural, religious rites, yeah? So many of the religious festivals that happen today have evolved from other festivals that were non-religious. So there is kind of a reinterpretation of something, and that can happen many times in the case of social norms.